My guest today is India's best-loved author and journalist. For 6 long years, the country's waited with bated breath for his autobiography, Truth, Love and a Little Malice, but it was held up by the courts. Released recently, it was published in February, and today he's with me to talk about it. I'm referring, of course, to the one and only Khushwant Singh. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let's first talk about some of the famous people you write about. One of your early bosses was Krishna Menon. He was High Commissioner in London when you were his press officer.
That's right.
Do you remember your first meeting with him?
I remember it very well. Got a very nasty encounter. I went and reported for duty at India House. My immediate boss was Sudhir Ghosh. He's the public relations officer. I was just the information officer. And I signed the visitor's book. I don't know whether I was meant to or not, being one of the staff. And I asked Sudhir to take me to Krishna Menon, who I'd once met in my student days. And he said, yes, I will. And this went on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. And then I asked my friend Arthur Lal, who was the trade commissioner there. And then one day, suddenly, I was summoned by Krishna Menon, and I went accompanied by Sudhir Ghosh, and with a broad smile, trying to remind him of my first meeting when I was a student and he was head of the India League. And as I extended my hand, hoping to be received, he had very claw-like hand. He just touched my hand and then exploded, and he said, Sardar, didn't they teach you any manners in India? So I didn't know what he was talking about. So I was taken aback. He said, you've been here 4 or 5 days, you haven't had the courtesy to call on your High Commissioner? So I turned around, I said, the very first day I've been asking for an appointment to come and call on you. And then Sudhir Ghosh butted in. He said, sir, it is my fault. I was doing this and I doing that. Then Krishna Menon said, I'm going to talk to you later. Sardar, you can go now. So I was looking forward to being in London after having just left Lahore, partition and all the nastiness, and was relieved that I'd got a good job back in the country, which I loved very much.
But he crushed you with the very first words he said.
And I spent the next hour walking up and down the Thames, which is close to India House on one side, and seriously contemplating putting in my resignation. I said, I can't work for a man who treats me like this on the very first meeting.
In fact, your novel suggests that he was a man with an enormous chip on his shoulder and a sadist who used to enjoy making other people work unnecessarily.
Well, let me tell you the sequence. That very afternoon there was a tea party for Indian students, and I was there, sulking. And he came up to me, put his arm round my shoulder and said, I hope you understood it wasn't meant for you, what I did. And if you didn't understand it, I'm going to fire you. You're not good enough to be a PRO. So, you know, I was again taken back. I said, the sudden change, this is all meant for Sudhir Ghosh and not for me.
But he was tactless enough to fire his bullets off your shoulder without realizing you may not understand.
That's right.
Another person that you got to meet while you were in London was, of course, Pandit Nehru himself. You were the PRO when he came for the first Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference. I get the impression from my book you weren't impressed with him. You found him surly, sometimes even rather rude.
Well, the incident made it so. We were all lined up at the Heathrow airport to receive the Prime Minister. It was nearly midnight in the winter time. And he came down and introduced, and the first thing he said, what are you all people doing here at this hour of the night? Why don't you go back to your homes, you know? I went up to him at the prodding of Krishna Menon and said, sir, is there anything you need me for? And he snubbed me. He said, this hour of the night, just go home. And I went home, and next morning I think then there was a Daily Herald, a Labour Party paper, front page picture of Pandit Nehru climbing the steps of a house with Lady Mountbatten and negligee opening the door.
So at midnight, having sent you back to your bed, he didn't go to his hotel?
No, he didn't go to his hotel, and I don't know how. And the next morning I came to the office, Krishna Menon summoned me, and he said, the Prime Minister's furious with you. I said, why? What have I done? He said, you've seen the Daily Telegraph, the Herald? I said, yes, I have. But I had nothing to do with it. I don't know how that photographer guessed that this is what Panditji would do.
In
at that
fact, if Panditji hadn't snubbed you and accepted your offer of help, he could have been saved this embarrassment.
I could have. I have further suspicion that it was Krishna Menon who tipped off the photographer.
Really?
Yeah, this is my suspicion. Otherwise, there was no reason why a photographer would be sitting there outside Lady Mountbatten's residence at night, hiding amongst the bushes.
So Krishna Menon wanted to deliberately reveal to the world the truth, as he saw it, of Panditji's relationship with Edwina Mountbatten.
That would be the inference. I'm willing to agree. He could do that kind of thing. Another incident when, before he was leaving, he took Lady Mountbatten to dinner at a Greek restaurant, very well known. I think it's called the Acropolis or something. It was in Soho. And this was meant to be just the two of them. They found a place by the side. And while they were eating, photographers turned up and took pictures of them. And they were all over the papers the next morning. And now nobody had any business to know.
Except possibly Krishna Menon again.
That's right.
So once again you think he was up to mischief.
That's right. He could do these things, embarrass people. So he could score off somehow or the other.
Were Nehru and Edwina Mountbatten lovers, as everyone has often said?
You know, they were both old. I think Panditji was past his time for making love. She was not particularly appetizing as a woman to look at. They were obviously very fond of each other. It was only his letters, which were published later, that you could infer that they had been close enough to cause embarrassment to Lord Mountbatten and the other members of the family. They were much closer than we know publicly. But whether they were lovers, I would probably say no.
So in fact, at this moment, if Krishna Menon did what you think he did, he was actually deliberately drawing attention to something that the world either didn't know about, or those few who did were prepared to leave quiet and unknown.
Quite right. But Panditji was an active collaborator in this, because after all, he did write so many letters to so many women, which were published later, to Padmaja Naidu and many others. He was a warm-hearted human being and very attractive, very handsome man, and obviously being in the limelight the whole time, women fell for him.
And he for them sometimes.
He responded, I think.
But it wasn't just Panditji's secret that you, in a sense, stumbled upon. You also stumbled upon Maulana Azad's little secret in Paris once, didn't you?
Yeah, that came as a pleasant surprise. I was again the press officer to the Indian delegation. And at one particular meeting, the day's proceedings, he used to come and make his great speech in Urdu and then retire. And some resolution had to was passed which needed his signatures. So I went to his hotel in the evening to get his signatures. And his secretary wouldn't let me see him. I said, but you know, I have to see him. This document needs his signature. He's the leader of the delegation. And then I discovered, to my pleasant surprise, that the great Maulana liked his Scotch, but he didn't want anyone to know about it.
So he was secretly sipping away, but
Yeah.
keeping it quiet.
That's right.
Now, of course, the two politicians, in a sense, that perhaps you grew closest to and came to know best of all were Indira and her son Sanjay Gandhi. Let's start with Indira. What was she like?
She was most impressive. I found her extremely attractive, physically, to look at. I did describe her in terms of Hilaire Belloc's lines, and I don't know another woman to whom they would fit. Her face was like the king's command when all the swords were drawn. There's something imperious in her small frame and the dignity which she held. You were in awe of her.
Were you attracted to her rather than just being of her?
She was a very attractive person. When she was nice, she could really turn you around her little finger.
The problem is you often say that she could be very nasty. There's a whole page in your book where you recount her incidents of nastiness to others and your constant fear that she would be nasty to you.
That's right.
Was she really like that?
Oh, I saw her snub people like Gagan Bhai Mehta, who'd been our ambassador in the United States. I had taken a whole delegation including Khaja Ahmed Abbas and Krishan Chandra, to plead for the release of the prisoners of war taken in the 97 war, the Pakistanis, that we defeated them. and it was wrong to keep prisoners of war. 93,000 or something there
And
were.
what did she do when you went to her?
Well, she received us. He was our senior, Gaganbhai Mehta. And as he opened, she turned to him and said, "Mr. Mehta, I know all about you. I don't want to hear you talk. I know what you've been up to." No, but none of us knew anything about it. And he just was taken aback and sunk into silence. And then I took up, and he just told me, "You may think you're a great editor, but you know nothing about politics," she says to me. And I said, "Mrs. Gandhi, I'm glad I know nothing about politics, but I know what is morally wrong cannot be politically right." So she said, "Thank you for reading that sermon to me," and silenced me too, but I had my say.
She seems capable of being really rather unpleasant.
She could be extremely unpleasant. That I got from many people who'd been close to her. Khushwant Singh, who's been foreign secretary, then ambassador in the States. She snubbed him. She wouldn't see him till I pleaded with her to see. And he came back in tears. Jagat Mehta, who'd been foreign secretary and been given the appointment as ambassador to Germany, she cancelled his appointment while he was due to leave and then refused to see him.
Tell me something. In that case, how much is she responsible for the breakup with Menaka? How much of the fault is hers?
I think largely hers. And that's why my chapter on which Menaka took me to court on grounds of invasion of privacy was entirely based on what she told me, Menaka had told me. And the way Mrs. Gandhi belittled her right from the time Sanjay was killed in that accident. The first reception she had was from Mrs. Thatcher. This was a few days after Sanjay's death, when Menaka was sat with the staff, R.K. Dhawan, Usha Bhagat, while Rajiv and Sonia were at the head table with the Prime Minister of
In fact,
England.
the amazing thing is, in that chapter that you refer to, you actually make Mrs. Gandhi look and sound really rather unpleasant and unlikable, and you almost take Menaka's side in explaining what happened,
Yeah,
and yet Menaka took you to court.
that's right. That's what surprised me. The whole chapter you read is pro-Menaka and anti-Mrs. G. And I did say that she behaved like a village mother-in-law and did belittle Menaka all the time, and all that the incidents of belittling came to me from Menaka and her sister Ambika.
So the story is actually from the horse's mouth.
That's right.
Now, of Sanjay, you say that you had affection for each other. That's not a sentiment many people ever speak of when they talk about Sanjay. Do you think he was a misunderstood man?
Oh, vastly misunderstood man. He was a young man in a hurry, a young man who wanted to do things for the country. He had no legitimacy except being the Prime Minister's son. He was not elected or anything, but he found himself in a position where his word became nearly law. But remember that he had three priorities: family planning, if not willingly, then by force; slum clearance, if not done legally through the law courts, then by force; planting of trees, greening the environment. And you see the effects of it today. The family planning redounded badly because it was carried out, for one, without any legitimacy, and there were vastly exaggerated stories of how people had been picked up from bus queues and cinema queues and forcibly
That's a
sterilized.
very interesting point you made. There were vastly exaggerated stories. Are you suggesting that when history is properly done, or maybe just with the lapse of time, we will recall and remember Sanjay differently, that the villain we think he was will be seen in a different light?
I have no doubt. I mean, I tell you, soon after that, when they were out of power, I happened to be in the Punjab, taken by Mr. Badal, who was then Chief Minister of Punjab, to many public meetings. They cashed in on the unpopularity of the emergency regime. And he introduced me and asked me to speak. And I asked those whole collection of villagers, I said, "How many of you were compulsorily sterilized? Raise your hands." Not one. Meeting after meeting after meeting, I asked this question, and Badal stopped me from, because they were cashing in on this.
And because you were probably embarrassing Badal himself?
That's right.
One last question on Sanjay before we end this part. Did you like the man?
I liked him very much. He was extremely courteous and polite to me. That was one. And he was a man in power. He could have easily afforded to ignore me after he'd utilized me for publicity or whatever. Not at all. And he had a man who could say no. And that's what I admired him for, because I'd been with him and many people tried to utilize me to get, tickets for the Congress party and all. And I went to him to ask, and he said, I'm not going to give that man the ticket, you tell him why. And I was pleased that he had the courage to say no to a person whom he liked.
That's an amazing quality. Let's take a break. I want to come back in part 2 and talk to you this time about how you reveal yourself, the image you paint of yourself in your own autobiography. We'll be back in just a couple of moments. Stick with us. Welcome back. My guest is the one and only Khushwant Singh. Let's talk a bit about yourself. The world thinks of you as a sort of expert on sex, maybe a modern-day Casanova. But in your autobiography, the picture you paint is of a shy, timid person, possibly even lacking in prowess.
Yeah, quite right. What I've said in my book is true. The rest is something people have fantasized and made me into a drunkard, womanizer, a fornicator. None of it is true. I'm a very hard-working man, works from 4:30 in the morning to 7. I have no time for womanizing or being drunk. I've never been drunk once in my life.
The amazing thing is that there's a wonderful story you tell about how Amrita Shergill almost offered herself to you, and you didn't even have the courage, it seems, to look her in the face.
No, she didn't offer. She came to my flat uninvited. I had never met her. She came to find out. She had moved to the neighborhood. She wanted to know about electricians and dhobies and washermen and servants and all that kind of...
The perfect excuse for seduction, most people would have said.
At 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 1 o'clock of a hot summer afternoon, no. It was later when she said some rude things about my son, a pretty curly little boy of 1.5, and my wife was very upset with her and said, I don't want that bitch in my house. She heard about it, and then she said, I'll teach that bloody woman a lesson. I'm going to seduce her husband. That day never came. I mean, I'd be quite happy to be seduced because I didn't have the guts to seduce anyone.
In fact, that is the truth, isn't it? Because your admirers and your friends are going to be shattered to learn that when it comes to sex, it seems you're all talk but no play.
That's true. That's true. I don't have the nerve. And I don't know why they have that image. I'm full of doubts about myself. I've never... I mean, if I had a man who made passes women, I'd probably have been slapped many times. By now, I've never had any woman say a rude word, nor her husband, nor her brother, nor her father, anyone. I pay them compliments they get sometimes. They misunderstand that I'm making passes.
In fact, you say a very interesting thing about yourself. You say in the book, I love to hear tales of marital discord, the number of times married couples had sex with each other. Are you a little bit of a voyeur?
But aren't all men voyeurs? Don't you want to hear stories of marital discord? Happy marriages are boring. Unhappy marriages are full of stories. Tolstoy remarked about it, and I think is absolutely true. And you want to compare yourself with others. You wanted to know if other men are better stud bulls than you are, then you feel a sense of loss that you're not up to them. And one always, you get close to a person, you
know, you're being incredibly honest, and in fact, one great quality about your book is the excruciating honesty with which you tell your life story. Not just reading between the lines, one gets the real feeling that there was a period of time when Mangat became perhaps the third person in your marriage.
Yeah, I've written about it with complete candor and not hidden anything from the reader. All that I knew, I have written. I have not spared myself or anyone else.
Was it very deeply upsetting to find that your wife, who you'd known for 60 years, you'd known from the time you were in school together, briefly transferred her affections to another man?
It wasn't very briefly. It lasted nearly 20 years. You don't call that brief. And it didn't get anywhere because I was there. But it was, as I mentioned, marriage is a sort of roller coaster. There were times of deep discord. There were times of matrimonial bliss, if you might use an Indian expression. And there are other times when we left each other to ourselves. I, being in a profession which needs so much time to yourself, I was relieved that she was not always overpowering and always not demanding my attention, left me to do my own work. So there were all these different phases in marriage.
You say in your book that there were at least 2 occasions when your marriage almost broke up.
Yeah.
Looking
That's
back on a marriage that lasted over 6 years, were you good for each other? Were you good to each other?
It's hard for me to judge. I mean, this is some question I'd like to put to her, whether I was good to her. I did my best to be good to her, which was not good enough, quite obviously.
Did she do her best to be good to you as you see it?
Well, that she was convinced that she was very good for me, and whenever we got into argument, which was often enough, she used to dismiss it with a quotation from one of Guru Nanak's lines, "Murkhe naal na lujiye," don't tangle with a fool. I was the fool. So she'd finished the argument, but just quoting that one line.
She died sadly late last year. By then, had you forgotten or at least forgiven the 20 years with Mangat Rai?
Totally, absolutely, because there were so many periods of extreme happiness and companionship, if I may use the word, that taking her to the cremation ground and coming back to an empty home, that's a very, very difficult thing to get adjusted to. And I'm trying my best to get adjusted to that idea that there's nobody in the house except myself.
You know, death, of course, is something that you clearly think a lot about. You write in your book, "I have dreaded it ever since becoming conscious of it."
Yeah.
Does that fear get worse with age?
Not now. As I get closer to it, I know the inevitable is close by now. The only thing I fear is the process of dying. I don't want to go in pain. I don't want to go in indignity of being in a hospital with some woman putting bedpans in my bottom and wiping my bottom.
You want to go as you are, fully conscious and
right.
fully in control.
That's right. At one time when I was on the hit list of the Khalistani terrorists, I hoped they'd get me because that going would be swift and I'd also get martyrdom
In a word,
bargain.
in a word, you've lived an agnostic all your life.
I
Will you
am.
die one too?
I am an agnostic to this day. I don't know how long I have to live, but I am an agnostic. I don't believe in God, and I don't think God would be very happy to see me when He does, if He is there to see me.
Khushwant Singh, a pleasure having you on the program, and I hope we have an occasion to interview you again and again and again.
Thank you.